Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin. Today, we're going to be talking about Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. But first, I wanted to explain a little bit about the format of this video. I'm going to be going over a few points of interest that would be useful for discussion. I'm going to give kind of a short summary of this book, and where it's applicable, I'm going to be adding a couple of my own analysis. So it's going to be all three of those things, but also it's going to be none of those things. This video is not meant to be a replacement for reading the book. It's not meant to be a replacement for having a discussion, and it's certainly not an in-depth analysis. I am just a simple social studies teacher. I do not speak Portuguese. I am not a scholar. I'm not an academic. My handwriting is bad. I'm not a YouTuber. But I think this is a extremely useful book to talk about. So we're going to be talking about this one. The version that I'm using, this book was originally published in 1970. This version that I'm using has this cover right here. I think this one is reprinted in 2017. So if you're looking for this one, I found this in my local bookstore in the education section, which I don't think is totally correct. This book is part philosophy, part politics, part education. It's very, very difficult to categorize this book. It really doesn't fit into any of those categories, which I think is what makes it so special. The main reason that I wanted to talk about this book, though, is that it is essentially a critique of left-wing behaviors and attitudes. And so I think for any revolutionary, that's this book's words, for any revolutionary, that type of critique is sort of useful to get started with. So let's go ahead and get started with this one. First, we need to talk about this word, conscientização. Like I said, I'm not a Portuguese speaker, but this word, conscientização, which is the best pronunciation that I can manage. This one in English, this one translates as awareness. The translation that I have calls this one critical consciousness. Critical consciousness has two parts. It's action and reflection. First, you are aware of the social, political, and economic contradictions, and then you also act upon them. And so in the preface of the book, Paulo Freire starts out by asking the question, and I think it's a very, very good question, isn't it better not to care? The opening pages of the book mention that if you know about the problems of the reality that we live in, you know about the issues that we're facing, isn't it better to not care or to not do anything about this? He argues that makes you less than human. So let me share a little bit of this here. Uh, this one, he starts out, he's describing a discussion that he had with some of his students. He says, in one of these discussions, the group was debating whether the conscientização of men and women to a specific situation of injustice might not lead them to destructive fanaticism or to a sensation of total collapse of the world, right? I think anybody who is left of center inherently understands that the world is wrong, and that is an extremely frustrating, and it is often a depressing place that often manifests itself in ourselves being destructive. But Paulo Freire is a little bit more positive about this than I think a lot of us are. He says this one, doubt regarding the possible effects of critical consciousness implies a premise which the doubter does not always make explicit. It is better for the victims of injustice not to recognize themselves as such. So this one, right? It is better not to actually think about all the problems in your life. Focus on your own small little world, and maybe you'll be okay, is sort of the implication behind this one. But we're going to argue against this. Paulo Freire says, critical consciousness enrolls people in the search for self-affirmation and thus avoids fanaticism, right? You're not a fanatic because you're looking inward to yourself. He quotes Hegel here. He says, "It is solely by risking life that freedom is obtained. The individual who has not staked his or her life may, no doubt, be recognized as a person, but he or she has not attained the truth of this recognition as an independent self-consciousness." So basically, humanity is found in questioning and struggling against these contradictions that we face and striving for our own freedom. So Conscientization is the first one. Next up, Paulo Freire starts mentioning discussions about history. There's been a few other writers that have talked about dead history, this idea that some people are only invested in history because it is immutable and unchangeable, right? You study history because those are facts and they never change. Immediately within the preface, Freire is arguing against this idea, right? History is alive. And while he's sort of criticizing right-wing historians for making the argument that history is just a bunch of facts, he at the same time criticizes left-wing historians as well. Let me read. This is on page 12, by the way. The rightist sectarian differs from his or her leftist counterpart in that the former attempts to domesticate the present so that he or she hopes the future will reproduce this domesticated present. So this one, of course, means like the right-wing tendency to always look towards the past as being something that was perfect and sublime and something that we need to get back to, right? Make America great again, and so on and so forth. But then he also criticizes left-wing historians as well. The latter considers the future pre-established, a kind of inevitable fate, fortune, or destiny. For the rightist sectarian, today, linked to the past, is something given and immutable. For the leftist sectarian, tomorrow is decreed beforehand, is inexorably preordained. When I first read this, I was a little bit nervous because this is on page 12. This is the very beginning of the book. I wasn't quite sure what I was getting myself into, but I think he's right here. Especially recently, we hear a lot of people talking about dying empires, late stage capitalism, right? We make comparisons to countries, hegemonic countries like the US as being the fall of Rome. So we have a lot of ideas about this world, this reality that we're living in is on its way out. We are on the cusp of revolution. We are approaching a post-capitalism world, right? This is an appealing idea, and I understand this one, and I've fallen victim to this type of thinking as well. But Freire is directly contradicting that by saying that if we just assume that the future is already prepared for us, we sit back and do nothing. When in fact, the future is not prepared for us. There is no guarantee that we're getting out of this. There is no guarantee that there's going to be a better world. We do, in fact, have to work for it. Let me quote Freire again. I wonder how many times I'm going to mispronounce Freire in this video. Anyway, this one, he says, this rightist and leftist are both reactionary because, starting from their respective false views of history, both develop forms of action that negate freedom. Let me skip ahead a little bit, but this one. These individuals make their own truth. It is not the truth of men and women who struggle to build a future, running the risks involved in this very construction, nor is it the truth of men and women who fight side by side and learn together how to build this future, which is not something given to be received by people, but is rather something to be created by them. Both types of sectarian, treating history in an equally proprietary fashion, end up without the people, which is another way of being against them. So really amazing quote here, right here from the beginning, which I really, really love. It also introduces this idea, which I think is the main idea of this book, which is that a revolutionary who is acting without the will of the people is not a true revolutionary. And again, I'm using the word revolutionary in his words. So this one, that's the idea of dead history. Let's move on to the next one. So let's move on to the next section. In chapter 1, Freire sort of outlines his general views about politics. We haven't gotten to his thoughts on education yet. So here we're going to be talking about oppression and being a revolutionary, being oppressed and being an oppressor. The first thing that we need to talk about is his concept of knowledge as being alive. This one, he says that the key point when you are serving the people is to be in communion with them. You need to be speaking with them. And so on page 13, he starts out with this where he says, on the contrary, the more radical the person is, the more fully he or she enters into reality so that knowing it better, he or she can better transform it. The individual is not afraid to confront, to listen, to see the world unveiled. This person is not afraid to meet the people or to enter into dialogue with them. When I first read this, I thought this was extremely obvious, lofty, borderline idealistic, but it is really clear, right? If you're hearing this for the first time or you've read this book just one time, you hear this and you kind of think, of course. Of course, we're serving the people. Of course, we need to be talking to the people. Of course, we need to be working for them and with them and not using them as symbols or using them in their name or whatever. It seems really simple at first, but the rest of the book is outlining the many different ways that, especially those of us on the left, sort of abuse this relationship with the people that we supposedly care about serving and working with. He talks about the withholding of knowledge from people. He uses a quote from Rosa Luxemburg, which I like quite a bit, which I would like to share. She says, as long as theoretic knowledge remains in the privilege of a handful of academics, in the party, the latter will face the danger of going astray. So in the beginning, sort of gives his minor, smaller, more obvious point, which is that those of us who are scholarly minded, those of us who are more academic than others, we need to be sharing the information that we have, right? Again, minor points, kind of obvious. Later on, he's going to say that this is far, far, far less important than the knowledge and information and communication that we have with the oppressed. Okay, let's move on to the next point. So we've talked before. The title of the book is The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. So we need to have a definition of oppression. He offers one that I think sort of hits upon what he means when he says oppression. And for this one, it's going to be on page 21. This one here. He describes this one. One of the basic elements of the relationship between oppressor and oppressed is prescription. Every prescription represents the imposition of one individual choices upon another, transforming the consciousness of the person prescribed to into one that conforms with the prescriber's consciousness. Thus, the behavior of the oppressed is a prescribed behavior, following as it does the guidelines of the oppressor. So in Freire's view, oppression is twofold. You're going to find that he does this a lot of two-part definitions throughout most of this book, and oppression also follows the same pattern, which is that oppression starts with a prejudice or a stereotype or some thought that you have about another person, and then the action that follows up with that. You think this type of person needs to be this way, and then you act in such a way that it creates that situation. This is, I mean, obviously really, really bad, but creates a dehumanized person. So his definition of oppression is something where you strip someone's humanity away from them with this prescription. And the answer to that is going to be humanization. This is easy to understand, right? Same thing with the concept about academics sharing their knowledge with oppressed people. It's easy to understand. It's a little bit more difficult to implement. It's a little bit more difficult to keep that in our minds and in our hearts when we're working on the behalf of oppressed people. Next one, talking about humanization. The opposite of oppression is humanization. To prescribe is to dehumanize. And so the the answer to oppression, the fix, the solution to oppression is to humanize others. This is a very hard pill to swallow when you realize what it means is that Freire is asking us to look at not only the oppressed as human beings, which is something that we all know that we should be doing anyway, but to also look at oppressors as human beings. It is really, really rough to sort of answer oppression with humanization, to see an oppressor as a fellow human being. Uh, I'm not 100% sure what the situations were when Paulo Freire was writing this book, but for me, that's extremely difficult to take. I don't know if I could look at a Donald Trump and try to see the humanity in him, but that is the suggestion that Mr. Freire is leaving us with. Let me share a quote. This one on page 18. This one, in order for the struggle to have meaning, the oppressed must not, in seeking to regain their humanity, which is a way to create it, become in turn oppressors of the oppressors, but rather restores the humanity of both. Hard pill to swallow, I think. So let's talk next about violence, because to me and probably to you, hearing Freire talk about love thy neighbor, and you need to see the humanity in the people oppressing you. It sounds a little lovey-dovey. It sounds a little idealistic. It sounds very non-realistic. So let's talk about violence. On page 29, I think he clarifies a little bit that he is not afraid of violence and he does not condemn violence in any way. This one, any situation in which A objectively exploits B or hinders his or her pursuit of self-affirmation as a responsible person is one of oppression. Such a situation in itself constitutes violence, even when sweetened by false generosity, because it interferes with the individual's ontological and historical vocation to be more fully human. Prescribing behaviors onto somebody and forcing them into that behavior, the prescription of it is oppression. In any way, if you cause oppression to another person, you are dehumanizing them. You're taking away their humanity, which is a form of violence. Furthermore, never in history has violence been initiated by the oppressed. How could they be the initiators if they themselves are the results of violence? How could they be the sponsors of something whose objective inauguration called forth their existence as oppressed? So here, I think clearly he says that violence by the oppressed is not to be condemned. He doesn't outright say it, but I believe that that is the implication that he has here. So interesting stuff. This one, let's move on to the next. All right, so now I wanted to get in what I think might be my favorite part of the entire book. So I want to take this one seriously. We're going to be talking about false charity, and we're going to talk about oppressors. Specifically, we're going to talk about being oppressors. Now, I'm originally from the US. I am living in Japan. According to Freire, I am an oppressor, and I agree with him. If you're watching this video, chances are you too, right? You too and I, we are oppressors. We may have a lot of strong feelings in our hearts. We may have a lot of sympathy. We may have a lot of compassion, but at the end of the day, we are oppressors. If you are living in the imperial core, if you are part of the middle class or even the upper class, who knows who's watching, you are an oppressor. And so the question is, what do we do about being oppressors? How do we stop being oppressors? Because assuming that you're anything like me, you don't want to be an oppressor. So this one, the first thing that Paulo Freire talks about is false charity. If you're familiar with any type of like communist thinking or any communist theory, you're probably familiar with this term, would probably be more accurately described as reformism. He calls it false charity. And let's hear what he has to say about this on page 18. So going back a little bit, this one, he says, only power that springs from the weakness of the oppressed will be sufficiently strong to free both. He's talking, of course, about freeing oppressors as well as freeing the oppressed, because you have to humanize both of them. To continue, any attempt to soften the power of the oppressor in deference to the weakness of the oppressed almost always manifests itself in the form of false generosity. Indeed, the attempt never goes beyond this. In order to have the continued opportunity to express their generosity, the oppressors must perpetuate injustice as well. So the first part of this is that there can be no appeal to oppressors based on the weakness of the oppressed. The oppressors will not provide anything to the oppressed because they are weak. They don't feel bad. They will never feel bad. Freire argues that not only will that never happen, but for any gift, any type of reform, any type of laws, charity, you build a hospital, you build a school, you make donations, whatever, is built on this oppressor-oppressed dichotomy. It is already built on injustice. And so anything that you do to try and soften that injustice is meaningless. It is false charity. It's false generosity. It continues here. True generosity consists precisely in fighting to destroy the causes which nourish false charity. False charity constrains the fearful and subdued, the rejects of life, to extend their trembling hands. Right. So if you're making a donation, if you're worried about some poor, pitiful person, if you are attempting to make a better life for somebody through your own wealth, through your own ill-gotten wealth, that is just putting another person in a position of weakness. True generosity lies in striving so that these hands, whether of individuals or entire peoples, need to be extended less and less in supplication so that more and more they become human hands which work, and working transform the world. So a lot of things in this one sentence. Any type of help, assistance, aid, or anything that you want to do to help the oppressed, number one, has to be in mind of strengthening them, to put them on equal ground. Remember, we are trying to humanize the oppressed. And so if you're treating them like someone who needs a handout, someone who needs donations or charity or whatever, you're still keeping them in a lower position of power compared to your relatively higher position of power. The second part of this, again, is that to humanize, to be human, is to act upon the world. You are not just existing in it. Later on in the book, he calls people who simply exist animals, which I think is the meanest thing that he ever says, but it's probably the most accurate. No, to be human is to speak, to act, to reflect, and to transform the world. It's a really, really beautiful sentiment, and it stems from us being oppressors, right? So then the next question, if you are an oppressor and you want to help, you want to change, you want to do something, what is it that he recommends that you do? I like this answer. This one on page 23. Discovering himself to be an oppressor may cause considerable anguish, but it does not necessarily lead to solidarity with the oppressed. I want to pause here for a little bit, is that a lot of us on the left feel really, really bad in our hearts, right? Our hearts are places where other people can't see, and our hearts are things that do not have an effect on the world. Rationalizing his guilt through paternalistic treatment of the oppressed, all while holding them fast in a position of dependence, will not do. Solidarity requires that one enter into the situation of those with whom one is solidary. It is a radical posture. I want to read it again. Solidarity requires that one enter into the situation of those with whom one is solidary. Radical posture. This one, he is saying, to stop being an oppressor, you need to stop being an oppressor. You need to be in the same situation as the oppressed. There isn't anything that you can do as an oppressor to make anything better for the world, to give someone else the opportunity to transform the world, to become fully human. If you are still an oppressor, you need to be in that world. You need to be in that situation. We're going to jump back a little bit. The dedication at the beginning of the book, I find really, really interesting. He says, to the oppressed and to those who suffer with them and fight at their side. This dedication is for the oppressed and the people who fight with their side. It is not for oppressors who might feel a lot of sympathy or compassion for the oppressed, but they are not the oppressed, right? To not be an oppressor, you need to fight by their side. Extremely clear. And I love that part. Probably my favorite part of the book, like I said. All right. Okay, so let's talk about chapter 2 of the book. Chapter 2 is the shortest, it's the easiest to understand. It is primarily focused on education, and it is also maybe the most depressing. In chapter 2, Paulo Freire introduces the banking model and the problem posing model. If you know Paulo Freire, if you know about this book, probably this is why you know it. This is probably why he's most famous. So to introduce the banking model with my own definition, this is where you have a teacher who makes a deposit of knowledge into a student's brain, and then that student has to withdraw the knowledge onto a test or whatever. It is the most traditional, most boring style of education that you can possibly imagine, where the teacher is trying to get the student to memorize as many facts as possible. This is my own editorial here, but I would also say that the banking model requires a lot of decontextualization, just memorizing facts sort of divorced from the situation that they're in. So his definition of the banking model is a smidge long, but I'm going to read it in its entirety so you sort of like get the so you get the impression of it. I think it also sort of creates the same impression of the banking model by this big long list of of things done in the banking model. But here we go. So the banking model is the teacher teaches and the students are taught. The teacher knows everything and the students know nothing. The teacher thinks and the students are thought about. The teacher talks and the students listen meekly. The teacher disciplines and the students are disciplined. The teacher chooses and enforces his choice and the students comply. The teacher acts and the students have the illusion of acting through the action of the teacher. The teacher chooses the program content and the students, who are not consulted, adapt to it. The teacher confuses the authority of knowledge with his or her own professional authority, which she or he sets in opposition to the freedom of the students. And finally, the teacher is the subject of the learning process, while the pupils are mere objects. This is the banking model. To begin with, we are all familiar with the banking model. All of us, probably no matter where you are, almost at any point in time, you have gone through the banking model. You have had a class like this, if not all of your classes have been like this. So why is this particular style of education a problem? He has a lot to say about this. So it is not surprising that the banking concept of education regards men as adaptable, manageable beings. The more students work at storing the deposits entrusted to them, the less they develop the critical consciousness which would result from their intervention in the world as transformers of the world. Skipping ahead, sorry. The capability of banking education to minimize or annul the students' creative power and to stimulate their credulity serves the interest of the oppressors, who care neither to have the world revealed nor to see it transformed. The banking model creates conformity, right? And conformity conformity makes it more difficult to question the world, and in doing so makes it more difficult to transform the world. Let me continue a little bit. Indeed, the interests of the oppressors lie in changing the consciousness of the oppressed, not the situation which oppresses them. For the more the oppressed can be led to adapt to that situation, the more easily they can be dominated. I want everybody to sort of think about any situation at whatever age that you are, being told that you have done something wrong and you need to fix yourself to adapt to the world instead of asking questions about why the world is the way that it is. If you don't have a good enough job, if you don't have a good enough education, people call you lazy or they call you a failure. If you don't get good enough grades, you're stupid or you're not studying hard enough. If you don't have the type of beautiful materialistic life that is expected of you, it's your fault. You are not meant to question the reality of a world where we need to work to buy more stuff for no good reason. You don't need to question the militaristic way in which education requires students to become like soldiers and to just follow rules and never question anything. You have no control over the world, and you are meant to accept that you have no control over the world instead of asking questions why. So this is why I say that chapter 2 is the most depressing, because this is not a unique situation. Like I said, we've all gone through this one. And this is my own editorializing here, but I believe that is also why Paulo Freire seems like such a nice guy to oppressors, is that I think he also understands that we all went through the same brainwashing as the oppressed and as the oppressors. We've all gone through this same sort of banking model education system, which has prevented us from thinking about transforming the world. And to add something else, the first victory of fascism is the one that happens within yourself. The first victory of fascism is when you stop thinking that the world can be different. You stop believing that that is possible. And that starts in the school system. It starts with education and it starts with the banking model. All right. So now let's talk about his solution to this one, the problem posing model. This one I think is probably a little bit more difficult to pin down, right? So what I want to do is I want to give his definition, and then I want to take some examples from later on in the book to sort of show what he might be talking about. So to use his definition, starts on page 52. I'm going to read several quotes in a row to sort of help everyone get a good idea about this one. Uh, this one. So short quote here, the practice of problem posing education entails at the outset that the teacher-student contradiction be revolved. Let me go back a little bit. Authentic liberation, the process of humanization, is not another deposit to be made in men. Liberation is a praxis, the action and reflection of men and women upon their world in order to transform it. Those truly committed to the cause of liberation can accept neither the mechanistic concept of consciousness as an empty vessel to be filled, nor use the banking methods of domination. So to do this one, we must become jointly responsible for a process in which we all grow. In this process, arguments based on authority are no longer valid. In order to function, authority must be on the side of freedom, not against it. Here, in the problem-posing method, no one teaches another, nor is anyone self-taught. People teach each other, mediated by the world, by the cognizable objects, which in banking education are owned by the teacher. The problem-posing method is where people are working together to fix a problem. You pose a problem to the students, everybody chimes in, everybody works with their own experience, they share their own experience, they learn from others' experiences, and those experiences are also shaped by the conversation, by the discussion. Let me go on to yet another one. This one on page 66. Like I said, I'm jumping around a little bit in the book. This one, for the dialogical problem posing teacher student. Here, he hyphenates teacher student. He's not talking about teachers and students. He's talking about a teacher student, someone who is learning at the same time that they are teaching. Well, the students are student teachers. They are learning at the same time that they are teaching. Anyway, the program content of education is neither a gift nor an imposition. It is not my sacred knowledge that I am bestowing onto you. It is not something that is to be hidden or locked away. It's something for everybody to be shared. But rather, the organized, systematized, and developed representation to individuals of the things about which they want to know more. This is why the problem posing education system is not about reciting facts. It is about looking at something that affects the students, right? Whether those students be younger or adults, it is something that affects them, where they are in communication with the teacher's in communication with them, trying to solve the problem. I feel like this is a little bit confusing, so I would like to share several examples from the book. The first one, I'm not going to quote this one, but I will just explain it. The first one describes a situation where there is a teacher student who is running a discussion with a group of, I think presumably men, but running with a group of students, teacher students, of course. And he describes a situation where it is late at night. There are three guys hanging out, chatting. They're having a good time when suddenly this loud, annoying, drunken man stumbles past them. Now, for the person running this discussion, his intent was to talk about the effects of alcoholism, and then maybe sort of get the discussion members on the path of agreeing that alcoholism is bad, right? But as he sort of neutrally presents this situation, the members of the audience listening to him sort of find themselves on the side of the drunken guy and not the three guys hanging around. They say, oh, this guy must have been working because he's drunk and he is buying alcohol. He is contributing to the economy. He's a hard worker. He's got a rough life. Whereas those three guys that are just hanging out, they're not doing anything. They're stupid and lazy. And so if this teacher student, if this teacher student had been trying to just moralize to them and just say, oh, alcoholism is bad, let me give you an example of why alcoholism is bad, then certainly that would not have had the same effect. And the person organizing this discussion wouldn't have learned anything. So sort of like presenting the situation and then finding out what the people think about this was extremely useful in this case. The next one that I wanted to give was an example from economics, where he talks about a situation, how do you teach more complicated subjects, right? So this problem posing model, and I'm a teacher, right? So this is something that I might think about doing with elementary school students, right? I would say to them like, oh, we have a student who's really sad. What can we do to help them? That's what it sounds like to me, and maybe that's what it sounds like to you. But here is, I think, a more adult and realistic example. So let us take the theme of development as an example. The team approaches two or more economists of varying schools of thought, tells them about the program, and invites them to contribute an interview on the subject in language comprehensible to the audience. If the specialists accept, an interview of 15 to 20 minutes is taped. A photograph may be taken of each specialist while he is speaking. When the taped interview is presented to the culture circle, an introductory statement indicates who each speaker is, what she or he has written, done, and doing now. Meanwhile, the speaker's photograph is projected on the screen. If, for instance, the speaker is a university professor, the introduction could include a discussion regarding what the participants think of universities and what they expect of them. The group has already been told that the recorded interview will be followed by a discussion of its contents, which function as an auditive codification. The team subsequently reports to the specialist the reaction of the participants during the discussion. I'm going to drop the rest of this here, but what I want everybody to pay attention to, and what I think is really, really key, is that he's talking about doing this discussion group with poor farmers, right? The amount of trust that he puts in these people to understand this university level economics discussion between two economics professors who have published papers is brave, right? Like I said before, it's easy to sort of say that we need to put our trust in people and work with the people, the peasantry, however you want to call it, the proletariat. But this idea, if you were to suggest this and say, "Oh, we're going to have a university debate, university level debate between two economists, and we're going to play it for a bunch of farmers," a lot of us sort of scoff at that idea, and it's wrong to scoff at that idea. To work for the people and to be for the people, to work with the people, you need to trust them. You need to treat them like they are equal human beings. They might not have the same reactions that we do, such as the case with the alcoholism, the alcoholic guy walking down the street. They might not have the same reactions that you have. They might not have the reactions that you were expecting, but we can and we should be trusting everybody to make their own decisions. Okay, let's go on to the next one. All right, let's go on to the next section. We're in chapter 3 now. I've been quoting from chapter 3 quite a bit, but right now we're going to talk about the main key points of chapter 3. There's a couple things that I skipped in chapter 3, specifically the conversations about limit situations and limit acts. To me, this was a little bit vague and philosophical. I did not find it useful. Perhaps you will. Just a reminder, I am not the authority on this book. You need to go read this, discuss this, and think about this on your own. But what I will be talking about is these two related concepts, verbalism and activism, and what I'm going to be calling the challenge of faith. So to get started, verbalism and activism is something that really struck me when I read this. This book is over 50 years old, and I felt like he was talking about 2026 leftists. So he's talking about the word. He's talking about dialogue and how you speak with people. And he starts out within the word, we find two dimensions, reflection and action, in such radical interaction that if one is sacrificed, even in part, the other immediately suffers. There is no true word that is not at the same time a praxis. Thus, to speak a true word is to transform the world. When you speak, when you dialogue with somebody, if you write or you have a discussion, you need to have clarity of thought, clarity of your reflection, clarity of purpose, and you need to have clarity of action at the same time. If you say something that is meaningless, if you say something that nobody intends on following through with, that is verbalism. It's talking just for the sake of talking. If you say something, or sorry, if you act without thinking, if you're lacking theory, if you're lacking thought, if you're lacking reflection, this is activism. I'm going to pause here for a little bit. This term activism is probably not the same way that most people would understand it. This does not describe protests. So keep that in mind. He's talking about action, not necessarily what we consider activism. So let me read about this one for a little bit. When a word is deprived of its dimension of action, reflection automatically suffers as well. And the word is changed into idle chatter, into verbalism, into an alienated and alienating blah. People don't like you when you talk bullshit. It becomes an empty word, one which cannot denounce the world, for denunciation is impossible without commitment to transform, and there is no transformation without action. On the other hand, if action is emphasized exclusively to the detriment of reflection, the word is converted into activism. The latter, action for action's sake, negates the true praxis and makes dialogue impossible. Now, I said when he's using this word activism, he's talking about acting just for the sake of acting. And it's not what we would consider activism today. Between me and the camera, between me and you, I think he is talking about activism today. I think he is talking about protest. I think he is talking about demonstrations that do nothing. I think he is talking about sort of empty behaviors that claim to be in solidarity, but in fact are just doing something for the sake of the oppressor to feel better about themselves, right? So when we speak, we need to keep these two things in mind: is the truth of what it is that we're saying and the action that we wish to follow. This is verbalism versus activism. The next part is going to be called the challenge of faith. This one, a lot of people who might be a little bit versed in communist theory would understand this as chauvinism, right? So when we talk about discussion, if you are any person who is even 5% invested in politics, you have had an annoying conversation with someone where you tried to get them to see your point of view and it did not work, right? This is the challenge of faith. So let me read this first and then we'll discuss. So, dialogue further requires an intense faith in humankind, faith in their power to make and remake, to create and recreate, faith in their vocation to be more fully human, which is not the privilege of the elite, but the birthright of all. So, like we said before, the purpose of education is to humanize someone. The opposite of oppression is humanization. And to do that, you need to talk with somebody on an equal level. You need to treat them as though they can understand everything that you understand. Faith in people is an a priori requirement for dialogue. The dialogical man, the person who is doing the discussion, believes in others even before he meets them face to face, right? I don't know about you, but I have a ton of negative opinions about conservatives whom I've never met and whom I've never spoken to. I am convinced that they are too stupid to understand me. This is a bad way of thinking, according to Paulo Freire, and I agree with him. His faith, however, is not naive. The dialogical man is critical and knows that although it is within the power of humans to create and transform in a concrete situation of alienation, individuals may be impaired in the use of that power. So, right, if you're like me and you're reading this book and you feel like, oh, is a little bit too idealistic, right? It's a little bit too utopian. What, we're going to talk to each other and we're going to fix the world. Everything is going to be sunshine and rainbows when you sit down with your conservative friends and you start talking about communism or equality or justice or whatever. No, right? You have to be critical. You have to understand that there will be certain people who are going to be opposed to what it is that you're saying, or there will be people who are not ready to understand yet. There will be people who are going to be opposed to you personally, right? It's not something that Paulo Freire is denying exists. He's saying that that tests your faith. It's a challenge of your faith in humanity. Far from destroying his faith in the people, however, this possibility strikes him as a challenge to which he must respond. He is convinced that the power to create and transform, even when thwarted in concrete situations, tends to be reborn. You're going to have a conversation with somebody. You're not going to be able to make them understand. You're not going to be able to have a dialogue with them, and that's fine. You're going to fail a couple times. You get to try again, right? That's the beauty of dialogue. And that rebirth can occur, not gratuitously, but in and through the struggle for liberation, in the supersedence of slave labor by emancipated labor, which gives zest to life. Without this faith in people, dialogue is a farce, which inevitably degenerates into paternalistic manipulation. Okay? So, in a lot of leftist spaces, there's a lot of ideas about certain people are not able to understand your lived experiences. I'm trying not to be snarky here. There is an idea that there are certain people who cannot or will not ever understand someone else, right? If you do not have this essential faith in humanity, if you do not put your trust in someone else, even when that faith and even when that trust is shaken from time to time, you will not be able to have a productive, transformative dialogue. You will not be able to have an effect on the world, right? It's frustrating. It's frustrating. I feel frustrated whenever I talk to people that I feel like I can't make understand me. The problem is always that you start from a position of trying to convince someone, which is a form of manipulation instead of trying to have a dialogue with them, right? Instead of trying to understand them, you are trying to proselytize to them. You're trying to convert them. Again, it's a form of manipulation and domination. And Paulo Freire says, don't do it. Sit down and have a conversation with somebody. Work through a problem together and see what you come up with instead of a confrontational attitude. If you want to take this, if you're an educator out there too, and if you want to take this as a way that you can communicate with your students, that's fantastic. If you're a leftist out there and you want to like think about the ways that you can communicate with other people as well, that's fantastic. I think this is a universal application against chauvinism, against the idea that we are somehow in any way superior because of our ideas, or that we have all the answers and that there are other people that don't understand. This is, at its core, a call for class consciousness. And I think it's important that we recognize it as such. The ability to look at another oppressed person, to look at another oppressor, and form a dialogue, reach the truth, and then from there transform and make the world a better place. So that's one of my favorite sections of the book too. All right, let's go on to the next one. Okay, let's talk about chapter 4 for a little bit. To introduce chapter 4, I think it's important to sort of look at the current political situation in which we live. I'm recording this the beginning of February in 2026. Like I said before, I'm originally from the US, so I focus a lot on US politics. In the US, we have a lot of figures and we have a lot of groups that are all about protests, and they're all about empty words, right? They're about verbalism and activism. For Paulo Freire, he would call these people useless, we'll say. He starts out chapter 4 with this quote, which I like. The revolutionary effort to transform these structures, the structures of inequality, cannot designate its leaders as its thinkers and the oppressed as mere doers. And I don't know about you, but I feel like I see this quite a bit, not just from useless political leaders. Specifically, I'm talking about the Democrats in the US, but there are useless political leaders everywhere who are interested in maintaining the status quo and who do not serve or communicate with the people, right? They are establishing themselves as sort of like the thinkers, and they are looking for other people to do the things that they are not doing. So again, when I hear this, I immediately start thinking about useless politicians, but I think all of us do this to some degree. I frequently post about things that I care about and that I want other people to care about. But after they care about it, I'm not quite sure what I want them to do with that information, right? Again, this is the word having no intention of action. I say, you need to care about this. You need to care about this, so I am sharing it with the world. The best that a person who looks at my posts will ever come up with is that they also need to post about it. It's a pyramid scheme, right? It is a string of people who are just sharing empty rhetoric with each other over and over again. And what's worse is that we shame or manipulate people into spreading this pyramid scheme idea. We want to be the thinkers and we want somebody else to be the doers. Not good. Not good, right? This is not what we should be doing. Anything that we say, right? Anything that we say that is not verbalism needs to have an action behind it. And so, with a lot of useless political leaders, with a lot of useless political organizations, they are attempting to manipulate people into doing the work that they will not do. And I think we need to recognize that we also are not doing the work that we should be doing. And we're kind of hoping that by protesting and by posting and by talking with people that we get somebody else to do it. And that's just not a good way to act. This one, also on page 99, manipulation, sloganizing, depositing information, regimentation, and prescription cannot be components of revolutionary praxis, precisely because They are the components of the praxis of domination. When you try to manipulate, when you try to convince somebody that you're right, when you try to shame them into doing what you think is right, or if you're just throwing a bunch of information at them, that is domination, right? That is not dialogue. This is not being in communion with somebody else. Let's go on here a little bit more. On page 100, adversely, revolutionary leaders who do not act dialogically in their relations with the people either have retained characteristics of the dominator and are not truly revolutionary, or they are totally misguided in their conception of their role and prisoners of their own sectarianism and are equally non-revolutionary. People who do not understand that they need to be in communion with people are essentially just oppressors, but a different type of oppressor. It's a great thing to think. Next on page 104, this one. People will be truly critical if they live in the plenitude of the praxis. That is, if their action encompasses a critical reflection which increasingly organizes their thinking and thus leads them to move from a purely naive knowledge of reality to a higher level, one which enables them to perceive the causes of reality, right? Anybody speaking to anybody else needs to focus on the world as it is and how to change it instead of small, little, insignificant things. If revolutionary leaders deny this right to the people, they impair their own capacity to think, or at least to think correctly. Revolutionary leaders cannot think without the people, nor for the people, but only with the people. The dominant elites, on the other hand, can and do think without the people, although they do not permit themselves the luxury of failing to think about the people in order to know them better and thus dominate them more efficiently. We see this a lot with, if you're thinking any type of news pundit, any type of influencer that thinks that they can teach the people what it is that they need to know is totally incorrect. It is oppressors talking to other oppressors about oppression, which is a useless endeavor, right? Let's continue. On page 107, this one. Those who steal the words of others develop a deep doubt in the abilities of the others and consider them incompetent. Each time they say their word without hearing the word of those whom they are forbidden to speak, they grow more accustomed to power and acquire a taste for guiding, ordering, and commanding. They can no longer live without someone to give orders to. Scientific and humanist revolutionary leaders, on the other hand, cannot believe in the myth of the ignorance of the people. They do not have the right to doubt for a single moment that it is only a myth. They cannot believe that they, and only they, know anything, for this means to doubt the people. Although they may legitimately recognize themselves as having, due to their revolutionary consciousness, a level of revolutionary knowledge different from the level of empirical knowledge held by the people, they cannot impose themselves and their knowledge on the people. The task of revolutionary leaders is to pose as problems, the task of revolutionary leaders is to pose as problems not only this myth, but all the other myths used by the oppressor elites to oppress. You need to believe in the good qualities, the intellectual capabilities of the people to be a leader, right? Let's go on. Next one. Here we go. So talking about manipulation. This one, either they must organize authentically for their liberation, or they will be manipulated by the elites. Authentic organization is obviously not going to be stimulated by the dominators. It is the task of the revolutionary leaders. It happens, however, that large sectors of the oppressed form an urban proletariat, especially in the more industrialized centers of the country. Although these sectors are occasionally restive, they lack revolutionary consciousness and consider themselves privileged. Manipulation, with its series of deceits and promises, usually finds fertile ground here. What he's saying is that if you are middle class, let's say, you're middle class, you're living in the imperial core, you live in an urban area, you're probably educated, you probably think yourself quite smart, and you probably think to yourself that you are smarter than a lot of other people, that you have more revolutionary knowledge than other people. No, you are just a little bit better at being manipulated. Let's go on. This one on page 122. In a situation of manipulation, the left is almost always tempted by a quick return to power, forgets the necessity of joining with the oppressed to forge an organization, and strays into an impossible dialogue with the dominant elites. It ends by being manipulated by those elites, and not infrequently itself falls into an elitist game, which it calls realism. If you read that paragraph and you started thinking about Democratic politicians, yes, I'm right there with you. 50 years before the Democrats were conceding to the Republicans in the sake of realism, or this is how things work. This is why Kamala Harris has to endorse a genocide in Palestine. This is why Zoran Mamdani is a Zionist and he needs a Zionist in his cabinet. This is why these things have to happen. We can't have Bernie Sanders run for president, et cetera, whatever. Right. All of this was predicted 50 years ago. The urban elites, the people who consider themselves liberal, the people who vote Democrats, have been tricked into thinking that this is how real politics are done, when in reality, they're just a little bit better at being tricked. With that, is just about the end of the book for me. Like I said, I was outlining some things that I thought were kind of interesting. I was outlining some things that I think are worthy of discussion. I hope I was provocative. I hope that even if you didn't agree with my analysis, or even if you didn't agree with Paulo, then you at least had something to talk about and discuss. I hope that that is a jumping off point for you. Like I said, I'm just some guy, right? I'm not an academic. I'm not a scholar. I'm not an expert on this. Like Paulo Freire himself, I am not a revolutionary, but I do like thinking about this and talking about this one. I would like to end with one of the things that he says in the preface here. From these pages, I hope at least the following will endure: my trust in the people and my faith in men and women, and in the creation of a world in which it will be easier to love. Thanks everybody for listening.